Innovation. Create the primordial ooze. On a sunny spring day in March 2010, Eric sat in his car at the intersections of Embarcadero Avenue and El Camino Real in Palo Alto, looking at the trees surrounding Stanford's football stadium and reflecting on the past couple of hours, and waiting for the light to change. He had just come from having coffee with Apple's CEO Steve Jobs at a restaurant called Calafia. Calafia is owned by chef Charlie Ayers, who is Google's first chef. The cafe on our main campus is named after him. But the reason Steve and Eric chose to meet there was that it was close to Steve's home. The two had sat outside at the California cuisine-oriented cafe, discussing Google's growing mobile operating system, Android. Steve was convinced that the open-source operating system was built on intellectual property created by Apple. Eric responded that we hadn't used Apple's IP and had in fact built Android on our own, but his argument was to no avail. They are going to fight us, he thought. Eric first met and started working with Steve Jobs in 1993, when Eric was at Sun and Steve was at Next Computer. Next was built using a computer language called Objective-C, and Eric and a few others traveled to Next's offices to hear Steve give them an update. Steve started extolling the virtues of Objective-C and tried to convince the computer scientists from Sun that they needed to use it in the next-generation programming framework they were developing. Eric knew that Steve was wrong on some of his technical points, but Steve's arguments were so persuasive that Eric and his Sun colleagues couldn't figure out exactly how he was wrong. They stood by their car in the Next parking lot after the meeting, dissecting the discussion and trying to escape what was often called the Jobs reality distortion field. No such luck. Steve saw them in the parking lot and rushed out to continue the conversation. For another hour. Steve and Eric built a friendship over the years, and in the summer of 2006, Eric was invited to join the Apple board. Before he accepted the job, he and Steve had a conversation about the potential conflicts of interest between Apple and Google. Apple was working on the iPhone, and Google had been working on a mobile operating system for about a year, having purchased Andy Rubin's company Android in August 2005. The definition of what Android would produce was still in flux, but at the time it looked like it would be an open-source operating system without a user interface. Other companies would build the UI. Our hope was that Android could become the software guts for phones built by companies like Motorola, Nokia, or Samsung, who would build their own designs and applications. Both Android and the iPhone were in their early stages, and Eric joined the Apple board in August. The Apple iPhone launched in June 2007, and it was nearly perfect. It was designed and optimized to be connected to the Internet, and it worked with a level of seamless convenience that was just great. Later that year, the Android team posted a YouTube video that unveiled what they had been working on. Steve scrutinized the video and concluded that the user experience it portrayed was too much like the iPhone's and its underlying operating system, iOS. Eric ultimately stepped down from the Apple board in August 2009, and the legal skirmishes between the companies and their partners continue today. Eventually, everyone who wants to will have some sort of smartphone, and most of those phones, at least for the next decade, will run on either iOS or Android. More engineers are developing apps for these platforms than for any other computing platform in history. It helps to have a potential user base of just about everyone on the planet. Dozens of manufacturers are competing, and their ups and downs aren't just chronicled in trade magazines, but in mainstream media too. This is obvious to us now, but it was only a few years ago that personal computing meant a PC running Microsoft Windows. Regardless of whose side you are on in the patent arguments, to be clear, we are on our side. There is no disputing the fact that these two platforms have spurred enormous economic development and innovation, and have changed people's lives for the better around the globe. Steve Jobs saw this future with great clarity. There is no better example of the impact a smart creative can have on the world than him. He embodied a combination of technical depth, artistic and creative talent, and business savvy that allowed him to create computing products with which people actually fell in love. He merged beauty and science in a tech community that had a lot of nerds and business people, but very few artists. The two of us learned a lot about smart creatives from working with and observing Steve, about how much personal style can influence company culture, and about how that culture is directly tied to success. Yet the most important aspect of the Android-iOS saga is how it demonstrates two different ways to achieve innovation. Both platforms and companies are tremendously innovative, and there are a few key similarities in our approaches. Apple and Google both operate in industries with extraordinarily fast product life cycles. In both the internet and mobile computing businesses, the next big thing becomes old hat pretty quickly, so we both need to innovate constantly or fall behind. Both companies tend to eschew traditional market research and rely on our own abilities to figure out what consumers will want. We trust our vision, and both companies place the highest priority on creating the best experience for our consumers. But beyond these similarities, our approaches to innovation are quite different, primarily when it comes to control. With Android, Google bet on the superior economics of an open platform and on our ability to navigate the fragmentation that results from such openness. Android is, and we mean this in the most positive way, out of control. The software source code is available to anyone to use for free under the Apache License Agreement. Written by the Apache Software Foundation, the Apache license allows the user of the software to use, distribute, or modify the software under the license terms without having to pay royalties. This open source model means that anyone can take the operating system and do what they want with it. Android is the sand in the sandbox. We also let anyone create and sell applications that run on Android-based devices. They don't require Google's approval. We encourage makers of Android devices, such as Samsung, HTC, and Motorola, to build those devices so that they are compatible at the application level, so that all Android apps run well on all Android devices. We are highly, but not 100% effective in achieving that goal, which is to be expected in an environment where there is no cost to entry and no controlling power. Android is growing and expanding in ways that we could have never predicted. It is used to power electronic readers, including Amazon's, tablets, game players, and phones. It can also be found in refrigerators, treadmills, TVs, and toys. Many pundits talk about the coming Internet of Things, when all sorts of devices, not just tablets and phones, will be connected to the Internet. We hope that many of those things will run on Android. Apple represents the opposite approach. iOS code is closed, and applications that want to be on the App Store must receive Apple's formal approval. Steve always believed that the best experience for the consumer comes from maintaining complete control of everything. He paid tremendous attention to the details in everything he and his company did, with a singular purpose of creating the best possible products. This showed in his extraordinary product presentations to his board, which were always highly orchestrated and produced as if they were Broadway shows. New products weren't just demonstrated at board meetings, they were unveiled. At Google, we regularly had APMs demo new products to our board, not just because they did it so well, though not as well as Steve, but also for the sheer theatricality of having kids a year or two out of college, sometimes wearing their alma mater's sweatshirt, show board members our newest innovations. We learned the value of that type of showmanship from Steve. Apple's control model works not just because of Steve Jobs' excellence, but also because of how he organized the company. At Apple, just like Google, the leaders are product people with technical backgrounds. When you build a team of great smart creatives and put the world's uber-smart creative in charge, then you have a good chance of being right most of the time. And when you are right most of the time, then a highly controlled model can yield tremendous innovation. As we were writing this chapter on innovation and sharing it with friends and family, whenever someone took issue with our principles, they would often use Steve Jobs as the counterexample. Yes, but Steve Jobs didn't do it that way, and look how many great things he created. They were right, of course. So we generally responded by saying that if they were the equal of Steve Jobs, with instinct and insights matched by few people, then they should go ahead and try it his way. But if you are like most of the rest of us, then when it comes to innovation, we have some other ideas you might want to try out. What is innovation? Innovation. It's the next big thing, or at least the next big word. According to the Wall Street Journal, some form of that word appeared in the annual and quarterly reports of U.S. companies over 33,000 times in 2011 alone. The exact number tallied was 33,528. Everyone wants to be innovative. The journal didn't supply a figure for the number of times Luddite appeared in those reports, but we bet it was quite low. But before we embark on how to do that, let's be clear on what it means. To us, innovation entails both the production and implementation of novel and useful ideas. Since novel is often just a fancy synonym for new, we should also clarify that for something to be innovative, it needs to offer new functionality. But it also has to be surprising. If your customers are asking for it, you aren't being innovative when you give them what they want. You are just being responsive. That's a good thing, but it's not innovative. Finally, useful is a rather underwhelming adjective to describe that innovation hottie. So let's add an adverb and make it radically useful. Voila! For something to be innovative, it needs to be new, surprising, and radically useful. Google's project to create cars that can drive themselves clearly fits our definition. It is new, surprising, except to Knight Rider fans, and radically useful. But Google also releases over 500 improvements to its search engine every year. Is that innovative or incremental? They are new and surprising, for sure, but while each one of them, by itself, is useful, it may be a stretch to call it radically useful. Put them all together, though, and they are. The Google search engine radically improves from year to year because of the power of all these improvements. Like 500 tiny steps forward. Collectively, they get you somewhere. This more inclusive definition, innovation isn't just about the really new, really big things, matters because it affords everyone the opportunity to innovate, rather than keeping it the exclusive realm of those few people in that off-campus building whose job it is to innovate. Google's search team, working on a product that is 15 years old, is just as much in the innovation business as Google X, the team working on the self-driving car. And this inclusive spirit gives most everyone the chance to come up with those really new, really big things. Understand your context. Google X has a simple Venn diagram that it uses to determine if it will pursue an idea. First, the idea has to be something that addresses a big challenge or opportunity, something that affects hundreds of millions or billions of people. Second, they have to have an idea for a solution that is radically different from anything currently in the market. We aren't trying to improve on an existing way of doing something. Rather, we want to start over. And third, the breakthrough technologies that could bring that radical solution to life have to be at least feasible and achievable in the not-too-distant future. For example, Project Loon, which hopes to offer broadband internet access to the billions of people who don't have it yet by using helium balloons, checks all three boxes. It addresses a huge problem with a radical solution enabled by technologies that either already exist or are within reach. Imagine something the size of a hot air balloon floating about 20 kilometers high and delivering wireless broadband service to the homes on the ground below it. That's Loon. On the other hand, time travel would probably solve a lot of problems and make some sports gamblers quite rich. But the technology is infeasible, or so we want you to believe. Cue evil laugh. Before the X team starts pursuing any idea, it first checks to see if the idea fits into this three-part paradigm. If it doesn't, it is rejected. Before there can be innovation, there needs to be the proper context for innovation. This is usually found in markets that are growing quickly and full of competition. Lots of companies are working on automated cars. Most of them are actually car companies. Don't look for empty space and then be lonely. It is much better to use an innovative approach to become a player in a space that is or will be large. This may seem counterintuitive, since many entrepreneurs dream of entering greenfield markets that are brand new and have no competition. But usually there's a reason the market is empty. It's not big enough to sustain a growing venture. It still may be a good business opportunity. Someone must make money off of all those niche products we see in the Sky Mall catalog. But if you want to create an environment of innovation, it's better to look for big markets with huge growth potential. Remember, Google was late to the search engine party, not early. Another element to consider is technology. How do you think the technology in the space will evolve? What is different now, and what further change do you expect? Do you have the talent to create sustainable differentiation within that evolving world? When Google engineer Paul Buchheit developed Gmail, he was innovating into a large and growing space, email, by betting that he could create a browser-based email system with as rich a set of features and user interface as a client-based one. Client-based applications use software programs that reside on the computer or device on which they run. Browser-based applications reside entirely on the Internet and are accessed via a browser such as Internet Explorer, Firefox, Safari, or Chrome. Since Google was full of engineers who could build great web-based applications, we had the talent to execute successfully on his insight. Therefore, the context for innovation was perfect. The CEO needs to be the CIO. Many years ago, one of our colleagues, Udi Manber, was an engineer at Yahoo when the company decided it wasn't innovative enough. So its executives did what any well-trained MBA types would do when faced with a problem. They put someone in charge of fixing it. They offered the job of head of innovation to Udi, and he accepted. But 3 weeks into his stint, he realized he had made a mistake. His bosses wanted him to set up an innovation council with forms that employees could use to submit ideas and a process for the council to review and approve those ideas. In other words, Udi's job was to set up an innovation bureaucracy. That's pretty much an oxymoron. So instead, he left the company. He may have been motivated by his 12-year-old daughter, who, when seeing him working on a presentation to give at an engineering all-hands, said, "You are going to waste hundreds of engineers' time to tell them that they have to be innovative? How innovative is that?" Udi eventually came to Google. He has been very successful here and has led some of our most innovative product teams, just not as head of innovation. The idea of imbuing one top executive with the responsibility for all things innovative isn't unique to this one company. A few years ago, a major consulting firm published a report advising all companies to appoint such a chief innovation officer. Why? Allegedly, to establish a uniformity of command over all the innovation programs. We're not sure what that means, but we're pretty sure that uniformity of command and innovation don't belong in the same sentence, unless it's the one you're hearing right now. As business managers, we like to manage things. Want something done, then put someone in charge of it. But innovation stubbornly resists traditional MBA-style management tactics. Unlike most other things in business, it cannot be owned, mandated, or scheduled. As Udi told us when recounting his Yahoo experience, innovative people do not need to be told to do it. They need to be allowed to do it. In other words, innovation has to evolve organically. It is the final destination of a path that starts when ideas spawn like mutations from a primordial ooze and traverse a long, perilous route from inception to fruition. Along the way, stronger ideas accumulate believers and momentum, and weaker ones fall to the wayside. There is no process by which to implement this evolution. Its defining characteristic is its lack of process. Think of it as natural selection for ideas. The general idea of natural selection for ideas goes back at least as far as 1976, when Richard Dawkins introduced the concept of a meme in The Selfish Gene. But what we're talking about is more akin to what Jim Collins and Jerry Porras described in Built to Last as branching and pruning, trying a lot of different stuff and keeping what works. To paraphrase Darwin from The Origin of Species, as many more ideas are born than can possibly survive, and as, consequently, there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any idea, if it vary, however slightly, in any manner profitable to itself under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving, and thus be naturally selected. P.S. Although we are evolutionists, we are not above trying to create some pretty amazing stuff in 6 days. All companies that want to be innovative, which is to say, all companies, need to start by creating an environment where the different components of creation are given free rein to collide in new and interesting ways, and then give these new creations the time and freedom to evolve and live, or, much more often, stagnate and die. The Chief Innovation Officer position is doomed to fail because it will never have enough power to create a primordial ooze, and only the ooze will lead to Oz. To put it another way, the CEO needs to be the CIO. God created Earth's primordial ooze. He didn't delegate the task. For you atheists out there, this is a metaphor. You may not believe in God, but even God believes in CEOs. Creating a culture of ooze isn't a new idea. Thomas Edison became famous for the unique throw-it-against-the-wall-and-see-if-it-sticks environment at his Menlo Park lab in the 19th century. In the 20th century, AT&T's Bell Labs and Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, were renowned incubators of innovation. The difference now, though, is the speed and scale at which the Darwinian struggle plays out. The Internet provides everyone with the tools of creation. Moreover, it is an ideal testing ground, allowing for prototypes to be rolled out and meaningful data to be collected in a fraction of the time needed before. Species evolution takes eons, but in the hands of smart creatives, today's process of idea evolution can, and needs to, work at Internet speed. Innovative ooze forms easily in a startup environment, when the culture is still fresh and the entire company has an us-against-the-world mentality. People who join startups crave risk. It's part of what attracts them to the venture. But once a company gets past about 500 people, it begins to attract more risk-averse employees. These can still be very talented, smart creatives. They just aren't going to be the first to jump. The fact is, not everyone is innovative. So the ooze doesn't just allow the innovators to innovate, it needs to let everyone else participate and thrive too. A few years ago, we were both captivated by a TED Talk by entrepreneur and musician Derek Sivers. He showed a video of a seemingly crazy man dancing all by himself at an outdoor concert. The man stands on the side of a hill, shirtless and barefoot, gesticulating wildly and having the time of his life. At first, no one goes within 20 feet of him. But then one venturesome person joins him, and then another, and another. And then the floodgates open. Dozens of people rush, creating a mosh pit of dancing fools, where once there had been only one. Derek calls this the first follower principle. When creating a movement, attracting the first follower is the most crucial step. The first follower is what transforms a lone nut into a leader. The primordial ooze of innovation needs to encourage the people who want to be innovative, the lone dancing fool on the side of the hill, to do their thing. But just as important, it also needs to encourage the people who want to join something that is innovative, dancing fools 2 through 200, to do their thing as well. This is why innovation needs to be integrated into the fabric of the company, across every function and region. When you isolate it under a particular group, you may attract innovators to that group, but you won't have enough first followers. Robert Noyce, co-founder of Fairchild Semiconductor and Intel, said, "Optimism is an essential ingredient for innovation. How else can the individual welcome change over security, adventure over staying in a safe place? Hire people who are smart enough to come up with new ideas and crazy enough to think they just might work. You need to find and attract those optimistic people. Then give them the place to create change and adventure." Focus on the user. In late 2009, a team of search engineers showed us a prototype of a feature that had been percolating for a while. It was based on a simple idea. What if we started to populate search results while the user was typing the query, rather than waiting for her to hit the return key? We had always believed that speed was one of the core factors in determining the quality of search, and we're proud that we answered the vast majority of searches in under a tenth of a second. But that clock didn't start ticking until the user actually entered the query. Typing the query could still take several seconds. What if we didn't have to wait? What if we showed results as the user typed? Once we saw the prototype, the go decision was a no-brainer. Both the organic and paid search teams got to work, and several months later the feature launched to the world as Google Instant. A few weeks before the launch, Jonathan was in his staff meeting when a basic question occurred to him. Would Instant affect revenue at all? Perhaps, when results populated as the user typed, the user might be less likely to click on ads. So he asked his team if we had enough good data about potential revenue impact. No, was the answer, and everyone agreed that someone should investigate it. Then they all proceeded with planning the launch. In every other company where Jonathan had worked, a financial analysis was one of the most important hoops that a product needed to jump through before getting approved. How much revenue will the product make? What will the return on investment, ROI, be? The payback period? Yet here we were, a few weeks away from launching a major change to our core product, and no one had performed a detailed financial analysis. The product was obviously great for the user, So we all knew that launching it was the best business decision. When Instant launched, it had only a modest effect on revenue. But Google has launched plenty of other features with a more significant financial impact. Knowledge Graph, which launched in 2012, populates the right-hand side of the web results page for queries about people, places, and things, with a concisely formatted panel of algorithmically curated information about that entity. It pulls all the most relevant facts together into one easy-to-read box. For most queries, the panel replaces the ads that previously appeared on that part of the page. That one hurt revenue a little bit. In early 2011, we made a series of changes to our search algorithms that reduced the quality scores of certain types of websites. We didn't want users clicking on links only to find themselves on crummy sites. That release, called Panda, affected nearly 12% of queries, and because many of the affected sites were part of our ad network, the change hurt Google's revenue. Google knows that in the internet century, user trust is just as important as dollars, euros, pounds, yen, or any other currency. Product excellence is the only way for a company to be consistently successful. So our prime directive when it comes to product strategy is to focus on the user, while not interfering with the internal development of alien civilizations. As Larry and Sergey put it in their IPO letter, serving our end users is at the heart of what we do and remains our number one priority. But focus on the user is only half the story. The full sentence should read, focus on the user and all else will follow. This means that we will always do what's right for the user, and we trust that our smart creatives will figure out how to make money from it. It could take a while, so sticking it out requires a lot of confidence. Not just confidence, you might say, but capital as well. What about companies, such as most small and medium businesses, that can't afford to ship products that may have great user benefits but no associated revenue or profit? You should still focus on the user, but be as scrappy as possible and invest as little as possible until the idea is proven. At that point, profits may still be well down the road, but if you have proven the user value, this becomes a financing decision based on sound data. But it is usually worth it. In 2004, Jonathan and fellow Googler Jeff Huber took Sergey on a field trip to meet with a small startup called Keyhole. Jeff, who had been the first product manager Jonathan hired at Excite at Home, was one of the lead engineers on the ads team. For years, Jeff's bio on the Google website said that he had a master's degree from Harvard. It's actually an MBA, but Jeff neglected to mention that fact, lest it harm his engineering street cred. One of Keyhole's co-founders was Brian McClendon, with whom Jonathan and Jeff had worked at Excite at Home. Keyhole had developed some extremely cool ways to visualize and interact with maps, and Sergey immediately decided that Google should buy the company. A few weeks later, Sergey brought the acquisition to the board for its approval, and when they asked him how we would ever make money from the technology, his response was simple. I'll let Jonathan answer that question. He's the business guy. Jonathan had been leaning back, enjoying Sergey's presentation, and had given exactly zero thought to how buying Keyhole might make Google money. Clear evidence that after 2 years, Jonathan was now guzzling from the Google Kool-Aid dispenser. Jonathan plowed forward with some muddled answer that was memorable only in how forgettable it was. The truth was that we had no idea how buying Keyhole would benefit Google's bottom line. The board decided to trust Sergey's judgment and let him proceed with the deal. About 8 months later, Google Earth, which was based on Keyhole technology, launched. It was an immediate hit with users and also generated millions of dollars. How could that be, since there were no ads on the app and it was free? Not long after we launched it, one of our smart creatives, Sundar Pichai, realized that all those people who were downloading and installing Google Earth might be interested in Google Toolbar as well. Toolbar was a simple utility that integrated with the browser. It had a lot of interesting features for users, one of which was a little Google search box that constantly resided in the browser's interface. People with Toolbar could initiate a Google search without going to google.com. So they tended to conduct more searches, click on more ads, and generate more revenue. Sundar's idea met some resistance, but with a push from Urs Holse, it was quickly implemented. This simple insight, that people downloading Earth might be interested in getting Toolbar as well, increased Toolbar's user base significantly and generated lots of revenue. But there's practically no way Jonathan could have anticipated it when he stood before the board that day. Looking back, we realize the correct answer would have been, I have no idea, but I'm sure we'll figure it out. Focus on the user, and the money will follow. This can be particularly challenging in environments where the user and customer are different, and when your customer doesn't share your focus on the user ethos. When Google acquired Motorola in 2012, one of the first Motorola meetings Jonathan attended was a 3-hour product review, where the company's managers presented the features and specifications for all of Motorola's phones. They kept referring to the customer requirements, most of which made little sense to Jonathan since they were so out of tune with what he knew mobile users wanted. Then, over lunch, one of the execs explained to him that when Motorola said customers, they weren't talking about the people who used the phones, but about the company's real customers, the mobile carriers, such as Verizon and AT&T, who perhaps weren't always as focused on the user as they should have been. Motorola wasn't focusing on its users at all, but on its partners. At Google, our users are the people who use our products, while our customers are the companies that buy our advertising and license our technology. There are rarely conflicts between the two, but when there are, our bias is toward the user. It has to be this way, regardless of your industry. Users are more empowered than ever and won't tolerate crummy products. Think big. Our colleague, Vint Cerf, has been working on a new suite of network protocols that will work in the harsh and very, very large environment of space. According to Vint, he started this project after asking himself what he could work on that would be needed 25 years later. His answer? The interplanetary internet. No one can accuse Vint of not thinking big enough. For the rest of us humans, though, it can be a different story. Perhaps it's human nature, or just corporate nature, but most people tend to think incrementally rather than transformationally or galactically. It's not that people suffer from a failure of the imagination. Lots of folks have lofty visions, but their pragmatism prevents them from trying to turn these into reality. This is explained by what psychologists have termed the expectancy value theory. In deciding which goals to pursue, people consider both the expected payoff and the odds of success. This calculation often steers them away from trying the most ambitious stuff, which, of course, jacks their failure rate even higher. As Hockey Hall of Famer Wayne Gretzky noted, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Our colleague, Regina Dugan, who is the director of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, a part of the U.S. Department of Defense, before coming to Motorola and then Google, talks about how innovation often happens when people are working in Pasteur's quadrant, which is where they try to advance basic science while solving real-world problems. The idea of Pasteur's quadrant comes from the late political scientist Donald Stokes, who saw Louis Pasteur as the exemplar of simultaneously pursuing basic and applied research. The quadrant represents the best combination on a 2x2 matrix of whether or not research advances basic understanding and whether or not it solves real-world problems. But most companies end up in the opposite quadrant, where the science is not interesting and no one cares about the goals being pursued. Talent exits and projects fail more often, not less. That's why one of Eric and Larry's challenges to engineers and product managers in Google product reviews was always, you aren't thinking big enough. In the internet century, with infinite information, reach, and computing power, global scale is available to just about everyone. But too many people are stuck in the old, limited mindset. You aren't thinking big enough. Later replaced by the Larry Page directive to think 10 times, helps fix that. It encompasses the art of the possible and the impossible. The obvious benefit of thinking big is that it gives smart creatives much more freedom. It removes constraints and spurs creativity. Astro Teller, the head of Google X, notes that if you want to create a car that gets 10% better mileage, you just have to tweak the current design. But if you want to get one that gets 500 miles per gallon, you need to start over. Just the thought process, how would I start over, can spur ideas that were previously not considered. There are other, more subtle benefits to thinking big. Big bets often have a greater chance for success by virtue of their size. The company can't afford to fail. On the other hand, when you make a bunch of smaller bets, none of which are life-threatening, you can end up with mediocrity. We see this all the time in business. The company with a large line of not great products. When Google bought Motorola and Jonathan started helping new CEO Dennis Woodside, he discovered that the company had dozens of different phones, with each device targeted at a particular market research-defined segment, such as millennials, Gen X, boomers, and soccer moms. There was some logic behind this. Different carriers wanted their own unique models, but it led to a sprawl of mediocrity. Each phone had its own set of product people who would work hard to make their product great. But they also knew that if their product was only good, the company would survive. Dennis largely fixed these problems and created a much more user-focused Motorola before Google sold the company to Lenovo in 2014. On the other hand, the iPhone is a popular product precisely because it is the only phone Apple makes. If there's a problem in the development of the next-generation iPhone, no one on that team goes home until there's a plan to fix it. It's no coincidence that Apple has only a few product lines. None of them can afford to fail. It can also be easier to take on big problems because bigger challenges attract big talent. There is a symbiotic relationship between big challenges and highly smart, skilled people. The challenges get solved, and the people get happy. Give the wrong people a big challenge, and you'll induce anxiety. But give it to the right people, and you'll induce joy. This idea comes from psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and his notion of flow, that joyous state of mind when you are so deeply, single-mindedly absorbed in your work that time seems to stand still. Your whole being is involved, and you're using your skills to the utmost. Csikszentmihalyi has said, flow is rare and precious because it requires the ideal match between a highly challenging task and your ability to meet that challenge. If the task is extremely challenging and your skill level is low, you'll be anxious. And if the task is no match for your abilities, you'll be bored. Creating opportunities for more frequent flow states is one of the jobs of managing smart creatives. They enjoy rising to the challenge for the sake of it, but also, as sociologist and management guru Rosabeth Moss-Kanter has pointed out, for the very real benefits it can bring. new skills, new connections with colleagues in the field, enhanced reputation. What economists would describe as investing in their human capital. Rosabeth Moss Kanter, drawing on her research on what creates commitment to communities and organizations, writes that knowledge workers are attracted by the chance to take on big responsibility and stretch their skills even further. The stickiest work settings, the ones people leave less frequently and more reluctantly, involve opportunity and empowerment. Cutting-edge work with the best tools for the best customers is important in the present because it promises even greater responsibility and rewards in the future. Knowledge workers want to build their human capital, their individual package of skills and accomplishments, as much as their financial capital. For these reasons, thinking big is actually a very powerful tool for attracting and retaining smart creatives. Put it this way. Let's assume you are a brilliant smart creative just graduating from college. You have two competing job offers, which are virtually identical except for one difference. One of the companies tells you that they like to try to make things 10 times better, while the other settles for 10% improvement. Which one will you choose? Our friend Mike Cassidy is a great example of the power of 10 times thinking in retaining smart creatives. A co-founder of a company called Ruba, Mike joined Google in 2010 after we acquired Ruba's intellectual property and hired its team. Mike is a serial entrepreneur. Ruba was his fourth company. His second one was a search engine called Direct Hit that briefly competed with Google before it was sold to Ask Jeeves. So we figured that it was only a matter of time before Mike would leave the Google mothership to start something new. Over time, we lost track of what Mike was working on, but we would occasionally see him around campus, so we knew he was still a Googler. Then, in June 2013, Google announced Project Loon, the aforementioned Google X project that aims to use helium balloons to bring broadband internet access to the 5 billion people who don't have it yet. We soon learned that Mike, who has a degree in aerospace engineering, was one of the Loon project leads and had been working on it for over a year. If it weren't for that opportunity to do something audacious, he likely would have left Google. So by continuing to think big and push the boundaries of technology, we got to hang on to at least one great smart creative. And doing big things that matter, as Larry often puts it, inspires people, even if they aren't the Mike Cassidys who get to be directly involved in them. We often hear people around Google talk about 10-timesing their job, even though most of their jobs are far removed from the audacious projects the company has become famous for. These are salespeople, lawyers, financial folks, all of whom are inspired by the company's prevalent attitude to shoot for the moon. Thinking big is not only a very powerful recruiting and retention tool, it's contagious. Set almost unattainable goals. The well-worn corporate manager has mastered many skills, and high on that list is the setting of annual and quarterly goals. This requires a certain finesse. Set the objectives too low, and you are obviously trying to make yourself look good by miraculously exceeding them at the end of the quarter. In sales, the practice of setting artificially low goals and then exceeding them by a lot is called sandbagging. Our first head of sales, Omid Kordestani, acquired such a reputation of being a sandbagger that he regularly delivered quarterly sales updates to the company from a small stage constructed out of sandbags. But set them too high, and you run the risk of failure. The trick is to find the sweet spot by creating objectives that look difficult, but are actually easily doable. The perfect scorecard at the end of the quarter and year is one that is full of 100% marks. In late 1999, John Doerr gave a presentation at Google that changed the company because it created a simple tool that let the founders institutionalize their think big ethos. John sat on our board and his firm, Kleiner Perkins, had recently invested in the company. The topic was a form of management by objectives called OKRs, to which we referred in the previous chapter, which John had learned from former Intel CEO Andy Grove. There are several characteristics that set OKRs apart from their typical under-promise and over-deliver corporate objective brethren. First, a good OKR marries the big-picture objective with a highly measurable key result. It's easy to set some amorphous strategic goal. Make usability better, improve team morale, get in better shape, as an objective, and then, at quarter end, declare victory. But when the strategic goal is measured against a concrete goal, increase usage of features by X%, raise employee satisfaction scores by Y%, run a half marathon in under 2 hours, then things get interesting. For example, one of our platform team's recent OKRs was to have new WW systems serving significant traffic for XX large services with latency less than YY microseconds at ZZ% on Jupiter. We have substituted WW, XX, YY, and ZZ for the actual numbers in the OKR that was shared internally. Jupiter is a code name, not the location of Google's newest data center. There is no ambiguity with this OKR. It is very easy to measure whether or not it is accomplished. Other OKRs will call for rolling out a product across a specific number of countries or set objectives for usage. For example, one of the Google Plus team's recent OKRs was about the daily number of messages users would post in Hangouts, or performance, for example, median watch latency on YouTube videos. Second, and here is where thinking big comes in, a good OKR should be a stretch to achieve, and hitting 100% on all OKRs should be practically unattainable. If your OKRs are all green, you aren't setting them high enough. The best OKRs are aggressive but realistic. Under this strange arithmetic, a score of 70% on a well-constructed OKR is often better than 100% on a lesser one. Third, most everyone does them. Remember, you need everyone thinking in your venture, regardless of their position. Fourth, they are scored, but this scoring isn't used for anything and isn't even tracked. This lets people judge their performance honestly. Fifth, OKRs are not comprehensive. They are reserved for areas that need special focus and objectives that won't be reached without some extra oomph. Business as usual stuff doesn't need OKRs. As your venture grows, the most important OKRs shift from individuals to teams. In a small company, an individual can achieve incredible things on her own. But as the company grows, it becomes harder to accomplish stretch goals without teammates. This doesn't mean that individuals should stop doing OKRs, but rather that team OKRs become the more important means to maintain focus on the big tasks. And there's one final benefit of an OKR-driven culture. It helps keep people from chasing competitors. Competitors are everywhere in the internet century, and chasing them, as we noted earlier, is the fastest path to mediocrity. If employees are focused on a well-conceived set of OKRs, then this isn't a problem. They know where they need to go and don't have time to worry about the competition. 70-20-10. When someone pitches you a new idea, are you inclined to say yes or no? If you have spent too much time in the wrong organization, your knee-jerk reaction is likely to say no. Or no. Organizations have a way of breeding antibodies whose sole purpose is to preach from the gospel of thou shalt not. Saying no lets managers avoid risk and reserve their resources. By resources we mean headcount, or for those of you who speak human, people, for projects that are more likely to succeed. Do I really want to dedicate precious smart creatives to that crazy project? What if it fails? They might pull my headcount next year. I think I'll just say no. and let my team keep working on streamlining the widgets. As much as people might preach about creating a culture of yes, including some very smart, handsome people who like to write books, it is very difficult to do without a structural framework to enable it. And when your most precious resource is your people, which is almost always the case, then developing a smart system to allocate those resources is a critical element to success. In 2002, we still managed resource allocation and our project portfolio by maintaining the top 100 list. But as the company grew, we all became concerned that this simple system would not scale well enough. We worried that a creeping culture of no might take hold. So one afternoon, Sergey examined the top 100 list and put the projects in 3 different buckets. About 70% of the projects were related to the core business of search and search advertising. About 20% were related to emerging products that had achieved some early success. And about 10% involved completely new things that had a high risk of failure but a big payoff if successful. That started a lengthy discussion, the end result of which was that 70-20-10 became our rule for resource allocation. 70% of resources dedicated to the core business, 20% on emerging, and 10% on new. While the 70-20-10 rule ensured that our core business would always get the bulk of the resources, and that the promising up-and-coming areas would also get investment, it also ensured that the crazy ideas got some support too, and were protected from the inevitable budget cuts. And 10% isn't a lot of resources, which is fine, because over-investing in a new concept is just as problematic as under-investing, since it can make it much harder to admit failure later on. $1,000,000 ideas are a lot harder to kill than $1,000 ones. So over-investment can create a situation wherein willful confirmation bias, the tendency to see only the good things in projects in which a lot has been invested, obscures sound decision-making. Jonathan saw this happen when he was at Apple and worked on the infamous Newton. For those of you too young to remember, or who worked at Apple and suppressed the memory, the Newton was a digital notebook that was a precursor to today's tablets, except for the fact that it was a #epic fail. A fact that may be interesting only to us. The Newton was manufactured in part by Motorola. The company had poured a lot of resources into the product, and therefore chose to overlook a major shortcoming. One of the Newton's major features was handwriting recognition. You could write whatever you wanted on the screen, and it would recognize what you were saying. Theoretically. The problem was that, for most people, it didn't work. In fact, about the only people whose handwriting it could read well were the people who had developed and tested the product, and even they had to adjust their handwriting to achieve their results. Nevertheless, a lot of money had been invested in the project, and the success of the handwriting recognition feature with this small, pliant sample group provided Apple with the answer it wanted to hear. The company plowed ahead with launch plans, and the rest, as the Newton itself might transcribe, is hamstering. 10% also works because creativity loves constraints. The phrase creativity loves constraints is a favorite of Marissa Mayer's. The counterintuitive idea that constraints can often foster creativity has been explored by a number of researchers. It's why pictures have frames and sonnets have 14 lines. It's why Henry Ford set pricing for his cars so low, because he knew that we make more discoveries concerning manufacturing and selling under this forced method than by any method of leisurely investigation. A lack of resources forces ingenuity. In 2002, Larry Page began wondering if it was possible to make every book ever published searchable online. Not just the most popular titles or some other subset, but every single book. We later calculated there were precisely 129,864,880 different book titles in the world. As of August 5th, 2010, anyway. See, you can count the number of books in the world on 25,972,976 hands. Google's official blog, August 5th, 2010. When every book ever published was available online, he reasoned, and when universal translation became available, then all of the world's knowledge would be accessible to every person. As the co-founder, Larry could have assigned a team of engineers to the problem and given them a nice budget. Instead, he got a digital camera, rigged it to a tripod, and set the contraption up on a table in his office. He pointed the camera down at the table, turned on a metronome to pace his movements, and started snapping pictures while Marissa Mayer turned the pages. Based on this crude prototype, they were able to estimate what it took to digitize a book and made some calculations that the audacious project was indeed feasible. Google Books was born. Sergey later employed a similar approach to see if Google's Street View project was feasible. He took a drive around town with a camera and snapped a photo every few seconds. He showed off the pictures in Eric's next staff meeting to rally support for what is now called Street View. Today, Street View covers over 5 million miles of roads. It's possible that Google Books would have happened if Google had funded it with a coterie of engineers and a healthy budget. But it's also possible that being well-funded might have hobbled the project before it could get started. Larry's scrappy digitizing system, built from parts purchased at Fry's is an electronics store near Mountain View, proved to be a lot more cost-efficient than the more advanced systems he might have purchased if he had allotted the time and budget. When you want to spur innovation, the worst thing you can do is overfund it. As Frank Lloyd Wright once observed, the human race built most nobly when limitations were greatest. The quote continues, "And therefore, when most was required of imagination in order to build at all, limitations seem to have always been the best friend of architecture." 20% time. In the summer of 2004, a Google engineer named Kevin Gibbs came up with an idea. He described it as a system to perform real-time completion against all URLs in our repository and all historical Google search queries, with results sorted by their overall popularity. In English, this means that Google would try to anticipate what your query was and suggest ways to complete it. Working in his spare time, Kevin developed a prototype and sent a description of his incipient project to an email list for people who wanted to share new ideas. The list allows its members to vote on ideas, and it automatically tabulates the votes, so that good ideas rise up the leaderboard. Kevin's proposal was called URL and Query Autocompletion with Demos. It was the 917th submission to the list, which at last count numbers over 15,000. The note included a link to his prototype, where people could enter queries into Google Search and watch the system perform the real-time completion. The prototype drew the interest of several other engineers who joined Kevin's project. Derek Sivers would call these engineers Kevin's first followers. This feature, now called Google Suggest, is why, when you type WE, Google suggests that you are looking for the weather forecast and provides you with a drop-down menu to click on the full query without needing to type the whole thing out yourself. Google Suggest shaves seconds off search times and helps users get exactly what they need, even more quickly. One guy, from idea to launch to global availability to how did we ever live without it for billions of people in just a few years. This is the power of 20% time. The Google program whereby engineers can spend 20% of their time working on whatever they choose. The 20 in 20% time is not to be confused with the 20 in 70-20-10. 20% time is about individual freedom, while 70-20-10 is about resource management, although perhaps it would have been less confusing if we had adopted 70-19-11 as our resource management guideline. 20% time has spawned a host of great products: Google Now, Google News, transit information on Google Maps, and many more. But it is generally misunderstood. It's not about time. It's about freedom. This is the sense of freedom that comes from doing what you want to do, not doing what you're told. According to self-determination theory, SDT, a prevailing theory of human motivation, all human beings have powerful needs to be autonomous, free to behave of their own volition, rather than in response to external pressure, competent and related to others. SDT posits that people find their work motivating and fulfilling to the extent that the work satisfies these needs. The program doesn't mean that the campus turns into summer camp every Friday, with all the engineers goofing off in hopefully creative ways. In fact, 20% time is more like 120% time, since it often occurs on nights and weekends. But it can also be stored up and used all at once. Jonathan had one product manager take a summer to work on a 20% project. Regardless of when you take your 20% time, assuming it doesn't get in the way of doing your regular job, no one can stop you from doing it. 20% time is a check and balance on imperial managers, a way to give people permission to work on stuff they aren't supposed to work on. It helps bring to life the Steve Jobs maxim that you have to be run by ideas, not hierarchy. The full comment was, if you want to hire great people and have them stay working for you, you have to let them make a lot of decisions, and you have to be run by ideas, not hierarchy. The best ideas have to win. Otherwise, good people don't stay. And we have found that when you trust people with freedom, they generally do not waste it on extravagant pies in the sky. You don't get software engineers writing operas. They write code. Google wasn't the first company to use this strategy. Back in 1948, 3M started a program letting employees spend 15% of their time on projects outside their core responsibilities. Perhaps the best-known product to come out of 3M's 15% time is Post-it notes. But the program also yielded Scotch tape, Scotchgard fabric protector, and innovative materials such as multi-layer optical films that are used in many of the company's products. William McKnight, 3M's president and chairman for decades, said his approach was to hire good people and leave them alone. The Street View trike, which lets us capture ground-level photos along streets and paths too narrow for cars, got its start when Street View Cars engineer Dan Ratner went on a trip to Spain. When Dan had to walk the last stretch to his Barcelona hotel through narrow alleyways where his cab couldn't drive, he realized there was a lot of great stuff that the Street View Cars couldn't access. When he returned home, he initiated a 20% project building a tricycle that could navigate these places, and the Street View trike was born. It has since been adapted to snowmobiles, to chronicle the ski runs at the Vancouver Olympics, for example, and pushcarts to walk the halls of some of the world's great museums. Up next, Street View skateboards. There's no doubt that when you give people a lot of freedom, they can be very difficult to rein in. A stubborn, smart creative sometimes won't take no for an answer. When is this okay? There is no absolute answer to this question. Like all aspects of leadership, judgment matters. But it sure does help if the employee turns out to be right. When Paul Buchheit decided that email could be a lot better, he started a 20% project he called Caribou. At some point, he decided that his new product, which is now called Gmail and has hundreds of millions of users, should generate revenue. So he suggested placing ads next to emails based on the content of the note. We didn't initially agree and told him to just concentrate on making Gmail great. We'd worry about revenue later. But Gmail was Paul's baby, and he ignored us. He hacked the internal system to talk to the AdWords ad server. Gmail plus AdWords equals combinatorial innovation. And one morning, we came into work to see ads alongside our emails. At first, people were angry, but then we started noticing that the ads were actually pretty useful. At the time, Jonathan happened to be trading emails with his siblings about what to get their parents for their 50th wedding anniversary, and a Gmail ad for Williams-Sonoma appeared in Jonathan's browser next to the note. His sister had brought up their mom's love of gardening, and the ad helpfully suggested a garden bench. Jonathan proposed the idea to his brothers and sister, and not only did his parents end up with a nice gift, but Jonathan got credit for being sensitive and thoughtful. This is atypical. Gmail launched a few months later. Its ads did not generate much revenue, but the technology that Paul developed to match ads with emails was later refined to improve our AdSense product, which is now a multi-billion-dollar business. Needless to say, Paul was not punished for his insubordination. That example notwithstanding, this doesn't mean that if you work for us and you have an idea we hate, you can just plow ahead with it unhindered by our boorish, wrong-headed, unenlightened managerial opinions. The first step toward bringing a good idea to fruition is to build a team of people who are committed to it. And while we may be clueless, your peers probably are not. Our constant advice to anyone who wants to launch a 20% project is to start by building a prototype, because that's how you get people excited about the project. Coming up with an idea is pretty easy. Getting a few of your colleagues to join your project and add their 20% time to your 20% time is a lot harder. This is where the Darwinian process begins. Finding collaborators can be difficult in a non-hierarchical organization, especially for newcomers, because it's much harder to figure out where to go to get things done. Relationships become highly critical, and since they take time to build, and this isn't everyone's natural skill set, you can end up with a lot of great ideas dying on the vine. One of our search teams tries to circumvent this through a program called Demo Days. The concept is pretty simple. A team spends a week building prototypes of new ideas that they will be expected to demo by the end of the week. Before the week starts, the engineers clear their calendars of all meetings and launches, no exceptions. This not only makes the demo days logistically possible, it serves as a forcing function to get everyone to commit. Since some people may be expected to work in unfamiliar areas, they can get training in the systems they may want to use. All systems are set up and ready to go, so there's no time wasted. They need to recruit at least one other person to their project. No teams of one are allowed, and are encouraged to collaborate with people they don't normally work with on a daily basis. Then the week starts, and they get on it. The result at the end of the week is a set of prototypes, generally shared in a sort of science fair open house on a Friday afternoon. Most of those prototypes won't progress any further. "I have a lot of ideas, and throw away the bad ones," said Linus Pauling. So the teams also learn that it's okay to fail. Steve Jobs once told Eric that he did something similar when he was running Next. Every 6 months or so, the engineering team would stop what they were doing and dedicate themselves to creating applications for the Next platform. This was a critical tactic to building their ecosystem, but it also gave everyone fresh insights into the work they were doing in their day jobs. The most valuable result of 20% time isn't the products and features that get created. It's the things that people learn when they try something new. Most 20% projects require people to practice or develop skills outside of those they use on a day-to-day basis, often collaborating with colleagues they don't regularly work with. Even if these projects rarely yield some new, wow innovation, they always yield smarter, smart creatives. As Urs Holzel likes to point out, 20% time may be the best educational program a company can have.